Today's video will be looking at what selection pressures are and how they work, specifically environmental selection pressures on organisms' phenotypes as the mechanism of natural selection. But first we need to understand what natural selection actually is. Sometimes natural selection is used interchangeably with the term evolution, but more accurately, it is one of the basic mechanisms of evolution, along with mutation, migration, and genetic drift. And I guess if we are going to try and differentiate between these terms as well, it's important that we have a sound definition of what evolution is too. Biological evolution is not simply a matter of change over time. Instead, it could be thought of as descent with modification. This is because lots of things change over time. Trees lose their leaves, mountain ranges rise and erode, but they aren't examples of biological evolution because they don't involve, and this is the key, descent through genetic inheritance. Evolution on a small scale encompasses changes in gene allele frequency in a population from one generation to the next, and on a large scale, it's the lineage of a new species from a common ancestor over many generations. Alright, so evolution is dependent on change, known as genetic diversity. But how does change come about? Well, as mentioned earlier, there are a number of factors that come into play which can be loosely lumped into the processes of mutation, migration, genetic drift, and natural selection. But as this video is supposedly on selection pressures, we'll be focusing on natural selection. However, it is important to know that mutations are the change in a DNA sequence, usually occurring because of errors in replication or repair. This impacts genetic variation as by introducing new traits. Migration, also known as gene flow, refers to the movement of individuals from a population of species that show a particular physical trait, known as a phenotype, moving to a different population of the same species that show a different phenotype. This affects variation by increasing the ratio of individuals expressing one trait while decreasing the ratio of individuals expressing another trait. And genetic drift, which is a mechanism of evolution in which allele frequencies of a population change over generations due to random chance events. This impacts genetic variation, as there may be a complete disappearance of a phenotype within a population, or it may become far more prominent. Hearing about these mechanisms, it is easy to assume that evolution is a random process. However, by unpacking natural selection, we see that there's actually a little bit more to it. Natural selection is associated with the phrase survival of the fittest, which essentially means that those individuals who possess traits that put them at an advantage over other individuals are more likely to survive, and therefore, over time, the population will shift until all individuals are inheriting the advantageous trait. As an example, there's a variation in traits, green beetles and brown beetles. Since the environment cannot support unlimited population growth, not all individuals will be able to reproduce. Now, the green beetles are more easily spotted by birds than brown beetles, so they tend to get eaten first, and as a consequence, don't survive to reproduce as often as the brown beetles. As beetle color is hereditary, the brown trait is passed on to the next generation more commonly than the green trait. After multiple generations, all individuals will be brown, and the original beetles would have evolved to be brown beetles. As you can see through this example, fitness doesn't always refer to being the biggest or the fastest. Fitness includes an organism's ability to survive, find a mate, and produce offspring, with the ultimate goal to leave its genes to the next generation. Therefore, natural selection is all about having the highest fitness relative to the selection pressures they are faced with. Finally, there is that term, selection pressures. As a mechanism of natural selection, selection pressures refer to the demands on an organism that determine whether they are going to be more likely to pass on their genes. In the beetle example, we used the selection pressure of survival, being able to avoid detection from predators. However, that might not be the full story. It could be that despite brown beetles being more likely to survive, they are less attractive to the females than the bright green beetles, and therefore are less likely to find a mate. Without a mate, they cannot pass on their genes and therefore would not necessarily have a higher fitness after all. Alternatively, the selection pressures may be different in different locations. An example is where having thick fur may be beneficial for a leopard in the snow, it would be disadvantageous for a leopard in the African desert. Selective pressures can include demands such as competition, predation, disease and illness, changing climate, and parasitism, which can both increase or decrease the occurrence of a particular trait. And that is why it is selection pressures that are ultimately the mechanism for natural selection.